Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Wednesday, October 25th. This week's show, we're going to do a little something different than usual, but it's an important topic to cover. The Indiana women's basketball program ranked 9th in both polls entering the season, a little bit less than a week away from their first preseason or exhibition game. And to help us break down this year's roster, preview the season, talk about expectations, talk about life after Grace Berger, Amanda Foster of Inside the Hall is here. Welcome back to the show, Amanda.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So kind of a loaded question to start, but how does Indiana women's basketball replace Grace Berger? It's I think, an important question entering the season. And when you look, just from talking to some people in the athletic department, people that have watched this program grow, nobody can say enough good things about what Grace Berger brought to IU basketball and the impact that she had. And so obviously there's a ton of expectations this season. There's a lot of good returning pieces, but how big of a challenge is it going to be for Terry Morin and the rest of the team to overcome the loss of Grace Berger? In a lot of ways, it's going to be similar to the men's team losing an important player like Trace Jackson Davis. It's kind of a pillar that the program has been built on now for several seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think you can replace Grace Berger. I think you can try to, you can't just pull somebody in and fill the role that she used to play, because nobody else can do that the way that she did. And so I think it's kind of similar to the men, like you said, where the Terry Morin and her staff are not going to be looking for people to be a new Grace Berger. They're just going to be looking for ways to play differently, because now that they don't have her, I think they're going to use new strategies. They have to play in a different way, because there is nobody who is another Grace Berger. And so it's a hard question, because nobody knows what it's going to look like, because nobody's played they haven't played a real game yet. And so you don't really know how that's going to work until you get into the competition of it all. But I mean, they've known this is coming. It's not like she got injured. They've had time to plan. They've had time to recruit, and they have an idea of where they're going. And from what it sounds like in the preseason, they're very confident in the direction that they're going. But it is going to be a big adjustment for people watching to not have somebody like Grace, and for people who were used to playing with somebody like Grace, like Mackenzie and Sydney, even, to not have that person to rely on anymore. It's a big change, because she was such a big part of the team, and it's such a big part of the program as a whole.
When you look at this roster, obviously there was experience last season of playing without Grace Berger because she got injured, and there was a time in that period where she was out, and the team didn't really skip a beat. They won a ton of games, that they were able to, a lot of programs, a lot of teams. I think if you lose a player of that magnitude for that long, maybe you fall down a couple seed lines, you don't win a Big Ten championship, but they were able to overcome that loss, and they were able to sustain the level of play. But now, kind of going into a season where she's not going to be on the roster, we know that for certain going in. How does that roll in terms of being the point guard, I guess, quote unquote, on the team? I don't know necessarily that you have to have a person that's the dedicated point guard for how Indiana women's basketball plays, and they have a lot of players on the perimeter that are versatile, can do different things. And I'm just curious how you think that will kind of be a by committee approach. Will it be one player particularly kind of facilitating the offense? How do you see that playing out as the season tips off?
I think it's going to be a combination of both. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in certain games it is going to be as committee, because the team has enough talented guards to kind of spread that around. But I think, and we saw this a little bit last year as well, in the bigger games, the more important games, I would be surprised if it was not Chloe Moore McNeil, because she stepped up when Grace Berger was injured. Like you said, she took on a lot of those roles. She was kind of the primary ball handler for them without Grace on the floor. And so she's proven that she can do that. And I think she's comfortable in that leadership aspect as well. Because with other guards that they have, sure, they could have the potential to play as a point guard, but do they have the maturity? Do they have the experience is another question, because most of them are underclassmen. And so, in the beginning of the season, I wouldn't be surprised if Terry Morin and the rest of the coaches maybe give the opportunity to some other players. But I think Chloe is going to hold down the fort, if you will, for the most part in that position.
How motivated do you think this group will be by how last season ended in the tournament? Obviously, there was expectations of making a run to the Final Four, competing for a national championship. And it doesn't really take anything away from the great regular season that they have, but a lot of times you remember what a team did in the tournament, and Indiana fell short in that tough loss against Miami at home. And I know it was something that was discussed a little bit at Media Day, but do you think it's something that the players are kind of, I know you have to put the particular game in the rearview mirror when this season's tips off and you can't like dwell on that one moment, but I'm curious how much you think it motivates them, the fact that they had this great season and they won the Big Ten, but then people can still say, well, you did all these things, but you didn't have a tournament run. How hungry do you feel like they are to actually do better this coming season in the tournament?
I don't think they would admit it, but I think that they're incredibly motivated by that, by the way that their season ended in a variety of ways. And like you said, they did touch on it at Media Day, kind of along the lines of, you get the impression, obviously they want to move on, but they haven't forgotten about it, just like everybody else hasn't forgotten about it. And the thing with this team, it feels like no matter how successful they are, they always play with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. Like it's always like they feel like they have something to prove, whether it's against a specific team that people don't think they're going to beat, or they want to prove that they're worthy of the national attention or whatever. They just want to, they want to win so badly. And so it always, like, it seems like there's always kind of that extra motivation for them that you might not see in other teams. And I think this is going to be a pretty big chip on their shoulder for the year, just because they did have such a good season and there's so much to show for it. But if the national media or people who aren't as invested in the program, they look at last season, sure, they went undefeated at home, but then they lost at home in the NCAA tournament. And that's what people will focus on, like you said. And so I think they're going to use it in a very positive way, because that's what they do with a lot of their detriments and their losses. But I don't see how you don't remember that and keep that in the back of your mind as some sort of motivation. I just don't.
Right. Mackenzie Holmes has been obviously one of the greats to ever put on the IU uniform. She's earned all of these preseason accolades. She was one of the best players in the country last season. I think I felt like even towards the end of last season, maybe she wasn't getting the respect nationally that she deserved for the season that she had. You'd see like the list at the end of the year, and they were talking about player of the year, and they were talking about these are the 2 or 3 best players, and it was never her name that was brought up. But for those that watched the team play last year and kind of watched what Indiana did as a whole, none of that is possible without the play of Mackenzie Holmes. And I feel like going into this season, maybe there's a little bit more respect nationally for what she did and for what she brings to the table. She's a preseason All-American. What's, in your eyes, maybe the next step for her as a player? Are there things that specifically that she can get better at? I mean, every great player goes into an off season and says, there's things I need to work on. But for her, is there anything specifically that you think can elevate her to another level? I mean, I don't think anyone expects her, obviously, to win National Player of the Year in a season when Caitlin Clark is viewed as kind of one of the greats to ever play in women's college basketball and is back at Iowa. But for her to maybe be a All-American at the end of the season, first team, or what is there anything specifically that she maybe needs to do better to raise her game to another level this year?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about her game in that aspect going into this season. I think because she was so successful last season, and the expectation is that she'll kind of just continue that. And so I guess that would be the biggest thing, is like for her to stay consistent, because we've seen like how good her footwork is, how well she can move in the post, and how effective she is in so many different ways, especially up around the basket and on the glass. And so I think I talked about this last year too, and it kind of didn't work out great because I was like, just don't get injured. And then she ended up struggling with injury again. And I don't want to say that again, but it is going to be a big part of it, is for her to play consistently at the highest level that she can now, because I think if she does that, she will be perfectly fine and be in the running for All-American at the end of the year. And so I think a lot of it is just about kind of managing the load and maybe recognizing that she doesn't have to do everything all the time. Even though Grace Berger's not there, there are other people that she can kind of not defer to, but like rely on, if you will. And it's just, she can't overwork herself I think, which is going to be hard for her because she always wants to be improving. And there are certainly ways that she can improve. But for me, there's not one specific thing that I can point to that she has to do on the floor that will bring this level of success. I think it's just consistency and making sure she's taking care of herself.
Yeah, there's an old saying, I guess sometimes you're, I don't know if it's an old saying, but being available and being able to play, staying healthy is just a big part of the game. And I think for her, probably, I don't know if she would talk about injuries or anything like that, but it's been obviously, it was something that was a problem last year down the stretch. And it was clear that times that she wasn't 100% healthy. And I think for her, just being able to stay on the floor for as many minutes as possible and being able to stay healthy is a big part of that. So I think that's a great point. A couple other players that I just wanted to get your thoughts on. Sydney Parrish, obviously, when she went to Oregon, she was a top 10 recruit, and she played a couple of years there, and I guess for whatever reason didn't work out maybe as well as she had planned. She comes home last year and has a great season. There's a ton of expectations for her coming into this year. Is she going to have maybe a more central role, or a bigger role on this team with Grace Berger being on in terms of scoring and kind of her responsibilities on the court, or do you kind of see her role maybe staying similar? I'm just curious maybe how she fits in now with Grace being gone, and does she have to take on maybe more of a scorer role and more of a leadership role?
I would think she kind of has to, in a way. I think she's a very natural leader. I don't think that will be something that she will struggle with, and I think it'll just come naturally to her in that sense. But I do think scoring wise, everyone's kind of going to have to step up a little bit more without Grace there, and with the way that Terry Moran was talking about maybe limiting how much Mackenzie Holmes played as well, which takes away, some more points that could be scored theoretically. And so I think Sydney's in a very good position to take on more of those responsibilities in both ways. She showed what she's capable of last year, and averaged 12 points and a little over 5 rebounds, and is very, very capable of playing at a high level. And she's coming in this year with a lot more what's the word? She's a lot more comfortable in herself and in her game. She talked about that at media day, largely because of what they did over the summer. But I think just having a second year now, she knows she's more familiar with the program, with the coaches, with her teammates, and everything like that. And I think that there's going to be a higher level of expectation for her in a lot of ways. She's going to be a senior. And I think she is going to be a bigger part of the team, not necessarily like the big part, and everyone's counting on her and everything, but she's going to be a big part of it, and I think she's ready for it. And it seems like everybody is very confident in her to do that.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that kind of makes this program and this team so special, is just the balance that they have, because they don't have to rely on one player night in and night out to carry the load. I mean, Mackenzie Holmes can obviously go out and put up big numbers and have big games, but you kind of look down the roster. One night it could be Chloe Moore McNeil. One night it could be Sarah Scalia. One night it can be Sydney Parrish. One night it can be Yarden Garzon. So all of those players together form kind of this, for defenses coming into a game. It's not like you can focus on just one or two players and say, we're going to stop this player and then we're going to win. And that's, if you look at Indiana basketball, the men's side, for a long time, it hasn't been that way, because like last season, it's been, Jalen Hood-Schifino and Trey Jackson Davis. Those are kind of the go-to guys. Whereas with the women's program, they've developed I think a little bit more balanced team, and a little bit just more options,
right?
That can kind of go score. Garzon's really interesting to me, because when I watched her play last season for the first time, I wasn't blown away, like in terms of her athleticism or anything. But by the end of the game, you look at the box score and she's done all these great things, and it's like, wow, she's like a really productive, impactful player. She to me is interesting, because I feel like she can really improve at a rapid rate, because obviously last season was her first year, and there's just a lot of room for growth. Do you agree with that? And like, what makes her? Because, and this is no insult to her as a player, but I think like when you just watch her play, she doesn't like blow you away just in terms of like her ability to just get by people or her athleticism. But man, she makes a a lot of great plays and a lot of impactful plays that contribute to winning.
Yeah, I think she definitely has a lot of ways that she can improve. That sounds bad because it's not like she, like you said, was bad by any means last year, but
No,
there's
she
a
was really
very high
good.
ceiling. She was really, really good. I think there's a high ceiling for her, which makes her a very exciting prospect going into her sophomore year. And I think, Terry Moore was talking about how she's like already filled out and improved a lot over the summer. And it's interesting because it feels like she kind of flies under the radar. At least she did last year. And, she would put up all these great numbers in the box score, but then you're like, okay, she was just kind of on the court. And I didn't realize, I wasn't like, oh my God. Yeah, other than when she would shoot like 3-pointers back to back to back a couple times,
Right.
she wouldn't be, taking all the attention. So it's an interesting thing to kind of think about. And I think part of it might just be the way that she plays. She played more kind of European basketball. She didn't grow up in the US. She didn't play basketball here. And I'm not well versed in the differences in basketball, but the way that Terry Moore has talked about it, there are some significant differences. And, I think she came in with an increased level of maturity and willingness to work hard and to grow. And I think she's been able to bring new things to the program here. And then obviously they've been able to help her grow into the college game. So I think she's going to be someone that is really interesting to watch and grow this year. But I don't really have an answer for why she's able to do what she does.
Yeah, I think
I think
kind of what I was looking for earlier was she's not flashy, right?
Right. Oh, no,
like,
not at all.
You look at her and I mean, she'll stick a three right in somebody's face, and then she just runs back down the court, and
Right.
it's like it's just
no
another play for her.
emotions.
There's no, it's business,
Yeah.
and I think what you make a really good point about where she's coming from a different culture in terms of how basketball is played, and I can really only relate this to the men's side because that's primarily what I watch and what I cover. But you see, like even in college and more so in the NBA, a lot of the players that come over from different countries, maybe not the same level of athlete, but their fundamentals and
Right.
knowing where to get to on the court to get their points and get their shots. That's a big part of the game, and focusing on those little details, I think that's really what helps her stand apart. So I think I really feel like the sky's the limit for her just in terms of her potential, and I think she's going to be in for a really big year. Chloe Moore McNeil is another player who is not really flashy, but in terms of her defense, she's one of the best perimeter defenders, probably not just in the Big Ten, but in the country. You mentioned her potentially playing some point guard and being a facilitator. How important is she in terms of just what she's able to do from a defensive perspective? And do you feel like she can handle the role of being the point guard and the facilitator on a more regular basis?
I think she absolutely can. It's been, I've covered the team basically kind of since she got here. And so seeing the way that she's grown and consistently gotten more minutes and more playing time has been really, really cool to see. And then last year was a very, very big jump for her, especially in terms of taking on more of a leadership role and a point guard position. And she showed that she could handle that switch kind of in the middle of the season when Grace Berger went out. And I think that's something that she would have been working on more and training more specifically over the summer. So I think she's very well equipped. I saw like her confidence shot up last year compared to 2 years ago. Like she started coming to press conferences and actually talking to people, and she wasn't doing that before, and everybody kind of knew it. And so I think internally she's proven to herself what she's capable of. And then that's going to come through this year. You asked a question before that, and I don't remember what you asked.
Just about the point guard position and whether she can handle that I know she had to do it some last year when Berger was out, but I guess I kind of said earlier in the show that you don't necessarily need a de facto point guard, but you do kind of need someone that's like the leader on the court in terms of who's going to facilitate the offense, who's going to bring the ball up the court when there's pressure. How are you going to, get into certain plays and start certain actions, and somebody has to start that. And it feels like she's the most natural one to do it. I'm just curious if you think she's ready for that.
I think she is. not to be like too blunt about it, but I think she's been with the program for a long time. She knows what's expected. She knows how to run. We've seen her play on defense in extraordinary ways, going up against Caitlin Clark and everything like that. And so she clearly has a very good idea of the game as a whole, and I think is really well equipped. I think she can see the court in a way that is really useful for everyone around her, and playing as a point guard in that sort of position, and having a very defensive mindset, but then also obviously being able to score as well, and kind of do it all, I think sets her up in a really good position to take on that role.
Sarah Scalia had obviously an injury scare in the offseason that I think had a lot of people concerned, but she's going to be fine for the season and is expected to maybe move into the starting lineup after primarily coming off the bench last year. Is there what are the biggest keys for her maybe in her second year in Bloomington to maybe become a little bit more consistent with her perimeter shot or become a better defender? What are maybe the keys for her to make the most out of her last year of eligibility?
For her, I think it really comes down to confidence. And I know we've talked about that a lot in terms of other players, but I don't know if there's a player who could benefit more from an increased level of confidence than Sarah could, because she showed at Minnesota how capable she was of shooting 3-pointers and making them very consistently, and then came here and struggled in that aspect, which I think a lot of people weren't expecting. But after kind of getting an idea of a little bit more of what her personality is like and who she is as a person, I think she is very much like, if she's confident in herself and her abilities, she's going to be great. If there's even a little bit of doubt or maybe a little bit of uncomfortability, that is going to come through at some point, because she would just kind of get in these slumps where she would try these shots that usually she would make and they just wouldn't fall for whatever reason. And talking to her at media day, she talked a lot about how she worked in the offseason about her confidence in just making like shots in game situations. And that's what she's been doing in practice and working with coaches. And so I think like all of the skills are there. The fundamentals are there. She knows what she's doing on an offensive standpoint, at least. It just, she needs to see the ball go through the rim a couple times, and then I think she'll be okay. Defensively, I mean, it's kind of a similar thing, I think, because I think it'll translate to the other end of the court if she's seeing her shots go down. And then, who knows, the sky's the limit, I guess, in that aspect, because we haven't seen her play to her full potential here yet. And so I think it's all wrapped around the mindset for her and just how she goes into each game and if she is feeling good or not.
Yeah, she has a great opportunity to get a lot of open shots based on the players that are around her. So if she can just knock the shots down consistently, then it really makes Indiana even more dangerous offensively, because as I said earlier, if you put 5 players on the court consistently that are threats, then it's really impossible for a defense to game plan. Where I think the question marks maybe a little bit are for this team is just like what the depth and the rotation is going to look like, because in the past, it seems like Terry Moran maybe has not trusted her younger players as much. I know a little bit more last year. She was willing to go to the bench and play some different players, but kind of looking down this roster, there's probably 4 or 5 players that you look at and say, well, they could have a bigger role than what they had last year. Or if you look at freshmen, there's a couple that were ranked, I think, in the top 80 in the country. If you look at the high school rankings coming in, I'm curious just for your opinion on who are maybe 2 or 3 of the reserves that you expect to be regular parts of the rotation, and kind of what role do you see those players taking on?
Yeah, I mean, based off of the trend, we will be seeing more players coming off the bench for a more significant amount of time based on the last few years, like you were saying. I think the 2 that really jump out to me are Lily Meister and Lexis Bargesser, because they already have some experience. Lily would come in and fill Mackenzie's spot as a forward when Mackenzie had to go on the bench, and she did a pretty good job in some pretty big moments. And everybody has kind of gotten the understanding that maybe Lily is being trained to kind of fill that role when Mackenzie is not here next year. But we could see that happen even this year if they want to limit some of Mackenzie's minutes and kind of give her a break or just put another forward on the floor. I wouldn't be surprised if we see her more consistently. And then same with Lexus, who had some experience as a guard. And even if I remember correctly, I think played like a de facto kind of point guard, at least took the ball up and down the court a couple of times in some of the less significant games that Indiana played last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they have both, obviously put in a lot of work, and, the chemistry of the team has grown, and they've grown just as people and players. And so I think they're going to be probably the two biggest players we see coming off the bench. And then I would honestly jump to the two freshmen with Lene Beaumont and Juliana Lamondola, because I think, and this is the thing with freshmen, is that they look good in preseason and they look good in practice, but you don't know what they're actually going to look like until they actually, play in a real game. But I think at least in the beginning of the season, it sounds like, my impression is that Terry Morin is prepared to give them the chance to play in these, to go out and try and prove themselves a little bit more than she was willing to, even last year or 2 years ago. Well, going from there, that'll decide how much they play in more meaningful games. But I don't think that they're going to be on the bench because they're freshmen. I think if they stay on the bench, it's because there's just something that's not working, which is interesting and going to be another change from what we've seen in the past. But I think at least in the beginning of the season that they have the chance to get some decent minutes against some of these non-conference opponents that might not mean a whole lot in the long run.
Yeah, I don't think it'll take long to figure out who Terry Morin actually trusts, because if you look at the schedule, the second game of the regular season is at Stanford. Yeah. So there's no real ramping up period. I mean, obviously we know the five, and then it'll be telling to me who are like the 3 or 4 that come off the bench and play, because that'll be the players that have earned it in practice and who have gained the trust of the coaching staff. Because it's not like, a lot of times, I know from covering the men's team, we'll go through 2 exhibitions and then we'll go through 3 or whatever for early season games, and it's the same thing over and over. And we're seeing I got somebody play 15 or 20 minutes off the bench, and you're writing a story. Well, this is a potential breakout player, and then they actually get into a game where it's a big time opponent, and all of a sudden they're only playing 7 or 8 players. I think we're going to learn a lot early in the season with that game at Stanford. You have an interesting perspective too, I think, on covering the women's program, because you've watched it for 4 seasons now up close. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the depth and the quality of player in the program is better now than when you first started covering the program? And do you feel like the recruiting in terms of just the overall talent has gotten better over the last couple of years? And how do you think they can sustain this high level of success once some of these players that are more experienced move on with what they have in terms of the young players?
That's a good question. I would definitely say the depth has improved. I think there's kind of no question about that, because when I first got here and when I first started covering them my sophomore year, it was really just the 5 starters for 35 minutes. There was really not much play off the bench at all. So that I don't know if I would be able to talk, say, if the talent has improved, because you had players like Ali Patberg and Grace Berger and all that when I first got here my freshman year. And so I would say in that sense, I'm not sure, but the depth definitely has improved. The recruiting has improved in my mind because of the talent and the runs that the team has made in the NCAA tournament, but then also just the attention that people are finally putting on the program as a whole because of how successful they've been and because of how talented they are. And so I think what Terry Morin has done a really good job of setting up these last few years is that stability. That, you had Ali Patberg leave, you've had Grace Berger leave, and Mackenzie Holmes will be leaving, but they're still getting these top recruits coming in, and they're still getting these transfers coming in, and nobody seems, not to say that nobody seems concerned about these, once in a lifetime players leaving, because obviously it's going to be different, but I don't see any sort of drop off, because it's bigger than one player. It's bigger than a coach. It's bigger than one season, because it's been proven that it is they are better than just one season, one player, one coach, because it's it's their 4th year of high level success now at this point, basically. And so I think, it is interesting because it's kind of been the start of something big. it feels like since not that before I was here, they weren't big, they were very successful, but the levels that they have risen to it's kind of been like very quickly. It's been a steep rise is what it feels like. And it doesn't seem like there's going to be a drop off anytime soon. I would be very, very shocked if there was.
Yeah, I think one thing that we're all guilty of, me included, is looking at like the rankings of a player when they come in and saying, well, this player's ranked top 15, they're going to be a superstar, or we do it all the time. And then you look at kind of what Mackenzie Holmes was ranked in the rankings when she came in. She was somewhere in the 50s. She wasn't even the highest ranked incoming player in that freshman class. I believe there was, I think, Jory Allen, who was part of the program. I don't know how long she was even there. She was from Bedford originally. I think she transferred to DePaul. I looked at the rankings. She was one spot ahead of Mackenzie Holmes in the national rankings. Okay. And you kind of look at the impact of those two players on the program. Like, that kind of shows you, if you're getting the right players that fit your style of play and you're able to develop them, it doesn't necessarily matter maybe what they were ranked. Would it be nice to have superstar players and what UConn gets every year with kind of an all-star team every year? Sure. But if you can coach players up and develop them over time, I think that's a sustainable thing. And I think that's one of the more impressive things that Terry Morin's been able to do with this program. So I think for that reason, fans should be optimistic that this is something that can continue for a long time, assuming, that you obviously fans continue to support the program, and, the resources are there to keep Terry Morin, which obviously they've shown a big commitment now with the contract, and they want to keep her as the coach. So I guess another question, I'm just, how surprised were you when you saw this offseason that they were going to start doing the reserve seating for the women's game? Because that was, to me, a pretty big deal, just in terms of just showing how much fan interest there is and how many people want to come to the games and support the team. I mean, I came to a game last season, late February, the Purdue home game, and that was a crazy atmosphere, and it was a lot of fun to watch. But now it seems like they're going to be having more atmospheres and more games like that on a regular basis now, if they're having to sell reserve seats, and the expectation is that they're going to continue to kind of build the following and the fan base.
Yeah, I was surprised, but I wasn't at the same time. I think that's kind of how a lot of people were, because I wasn't surprised in the fact, like, they have a lot of loyal fans that have stuck around for a long time, because a lot of their fans, and this is kind of where it seems like the team differs from the men's team, a lot of their fans are like families with young kids, or older Bloomington locals that come and watch the games and who've seen this program for who knows how many years. And so it's not all just students. And so I think they really benefit from having those reserve seating, because it's, in a way, it's kind of like a nod to the people who have been loyal for so long that now you have guaranteed seating, right? I guess, because it's like, thank you for coming. Here's a way to make sure that you'll be able to come back. And it also just shows how in demand the tickets are, because so many people want to, like, obviously there was a demand for reserve seating or they wouldn't have done it. So people want to consistently go to these games and consistently see this team play, which is huge. And you get that idea when you're covering them and you see how big the crowds are consistently. So in that aspect, I wasn't surprised that they made the jump to do that. And it's also a business decision. And in that sense is also like, if you can benefit off of the success of a program, right, why not? So yeah, exactly. I think it's going to be really exciting. I think they got to expand the student section. That needs to be figured out in some sense, because, and I don't know if that was a part of the reserve seating aspect of it all, because some of it was a little confusing for me to try to read through. But the little student section behind the basket is not cutting it anymore, to put it plainly.
When you get to a situation where late in the season you're having all the tickets sold and you're having sellout games, it makes sense to kind of go to that model. Also, just from a logistics standpoint, if you're going to have that many people showing up for a game, you don't want people lining up 2 hours before the game and like trampling each other trying to get a better seat. So that's kind of another thing, because I didn't experience that specifically when I came to the Purdue game last season, but there was people lined up and people were wanting to get in there and get a good seat, which I understand. So I think it's a win-win for everybody. I think, like you said, it rewards the people that have been coming for a long time, and they can not feel like they have to, fight people off for a good seat.
Go
You never want
stand
to be in
in
that.
the middle of January
Right. Or in
to get a good
February when
seat.
it's
Yeah, right.
exactly.
Yeah.
Last thing I wanted to ask you about before we wrap up. Obviously, Iowa's the favorite to win the Big Ten. I think
Yep.
everybody knows that. Who are, and I don't necessarily, everyone that follows women's basketball knows why Iowa's such a good team. They're such a good program. They're a threat to win the national championship. Who are some of the other teams maybe at near the top of the Big Ten that you're looking forward to watching this year? And who are some of the teams that Indiana's going to be fighting for at the top of the Big Ten besides Iowa?
The number one for me, and this is kind of I think has been reflected in a couple of the polls, Ohio State. As much as Iowa is going to be very well equipped, I would put Ohio State as maybe even above them because of the returning play that they have. Obviously, Caitlin Clark drives Iowa. Who else? It doesn't really matter who else they have, but
Right.
Ohio State is also going to have an incredible amount of talent and young talent who will have developed even more, kind of like we talked about with Indiana. And I mean, we all saw how good Ohio State was last year. And I think they're in a very good position to be just as good, if not better. So I think if there was a top three, I think it would be some combination of Ohio State, Iowa, and Indiana. I'm also excited about Illinois because they were able to kind of make that jump last year and become a contender. They were ranked a couple times. They took a lot of people by surprise. And they have some really good talent. And I like Shauna Green. I think she was really cool. And so I'm interested to see. I don't know if I think they're going to be middle of the pack. I don't think they're going to be up top necessarily competing for a title or anything like that. But I think they could maybe take some people by surprise. Maryland, as always, is going to be Maryland, and Brenda Freese knows what she's doing, even if her team looks relatively new, because last year her team looked relatively new and then they were very, very successful late into the tournament. So I think they would probably come in around a number 4 spot for me. And then the Big Ten is the Big Ten, and then anything could happen. But I think
is Purdue kind of on the rise a little bit more than they in terms of the program. It seems like obviously it's been kind of a one-sided rivalry now for a while, but it does seem like they're getting better talent, and obviously they have a pretty good coach, so they seem like they're at least going to be able to maybe not beat Indiana anytime soon, but at least make it a more competitive rivalry than it's been.
Yeah, I would put Purdue in the upper part of the middle part of the conference, if that makes sense, because of the way that their program has been built. And they were even able to compete at times with Indiana last year and lock down on defense. And so they showed their potential to do that. And you're right that Katie Gerald's is a very charismatic woman and she knows how to build a good program. And I remember talking to her 2 years ago when Purdue came to play Indiana and how focused she was on kind of just building a program and then having the success later. And I think we're finally seeing that she has built a program and her players trust her and they believe in what she's built. And now I think that is kind of coming to fruition for them more, and they are going to be more of a threat than they have been in the past.
Yeah, their fans can't be happy though when they look on the sidelines in Bloomington and see one of their alums coaching Indiana to the level of program that it is right now. But that's kind of how it goes. And I think just even on the men's and women's side, I think the rivalries are better when both programs are good. And I think we've seen that the last couple of years with Indiana and Purdue on the men's side. It was like Purdue just dominated Indiana for so long, and now Indiana's taken the last 3 or 4. So, okay, we've got a rivalry again. And I think from a women's perspective, I think it would be good for both programs, right? Because to have your rival kind of fighting for the same thing that you are, it only makes the games matter more. And I know it means a lot to both fan bases. So it'll be fun to watch. Amanda, I know you'll be writing about both the men's and the women's team all season on Inside the Hall. We're excited to have you back for another year. I also know that you're hosting your own women's basketball podcast. How can people find that and check that out if they're interested in more conversation on the women's team?
Yeah, so I'm hosting that with Kevin Vera, who has also covered the women in the past. So we're very excited about that. It will be under Crimson Cast on
Okay.
Spotify and Apple Music and everything like that. It'll come out just about every week. Once the season gets going, we're recording the first episode tomorrow, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, under Crimson Cast, just in their normal span of podcasts that they
Episodes.
put out. Yeah.
Yep.
And it'll have some specific title for women's basketball, but yeah.
Well, good stuff. Thanks for the time today, Amanda. Thanks everybody, as always, for listening to this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a 5-star rating or review, a nice review on Apple Podcasts. No bad reviews, please. And a 5-star review on Spotify. We would really appreciate it. It helps more people find the show and things like that. So it's a quick and easy thing that you can do if you enjoy the show. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.